This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 215 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So I wanted to kick off today's episode about a topic that gets brought up every once in a while about the structure of this show. I actually got a question this week from @TaylorPastana about it. The tweet said, would you ever consider making the podcast longer and diving deeper into subjects and or covering more subjects? Love the show, but always feel that it's over in the blink of an eye. All the while, about a week ago, I got what I'd call a snarky comment from someone else on Twitter who voiced his opinion about the length of the show, specifically making reference that I don't answer enough questions on the Mailbag episode each week. So I wanted to address all this. I'm not trying to start drama, and I think the questions are valid. A lot of you are used to hearing hour-long podcasts when this one will hover the 15-minute mark, and you may feel like you're being cheated out of content in a way. For me, the hard part about feedback isn't really the harshness of it. It's how it usually contradicts other feedback that I get. While one person says they hate the length of the show, I get 3 others who are saying that they love the length of the show. So right off the bat, there's conflict. But I want to be transparent with you guys in how I actually feel about this topic. Making the episodes as short as they are was a strategic choice that I made when I started this podcast. Not only was it a way to differentiate the podcast compared to others that are in this space, but there was also an opening out there for the people who may not have a ton of time to listen to a fantasy football podcast. Not everyone has an hour or an hour and a half to listen to a show. And not everyone wants to listen to a podcast that long. But not only that, guys, this shit is hard. I mean, it's seriously time consuming. I'm not saying that to get sympathy from you. I'm saying that because if I did a solo podcast that was 30 minutes or 45 minutes long, that was just me talking about specific fantasy football topics multiple times per week, that would take a really long time to produce. I have another podcast that I do with a co-host, and I've been on a ton of other podcasts. It's much easier to get that length when you've got another person involved. And that's also what she said. But being brief and removing fluff from the show also forces me to only give you guys important information for fantasy football success. It makes it a little bit more actionable, in my opinion. And one thing I try to do with the Late Round Podcast is not just cover really high-level topics that you may find somewhere else. I'll do an episode on handcuffing running backs. I'll do one on spotting a breakout running back or a breakout wide receiver. Those are pretty specific topics where it's almost impossible to talk about that topic, especially when it's tightly edited, for more than 20 minutes. So to answer all of those questions pretty directly, I totally understand if you don't like the show the way it's laid out. It won't be for everyone. I want it to be for everyone, but I understand that it won't be. And I can tell you confidently that if I made these solo shows longer, they wouldn't have the same impact. I also don't even know how I could do that with most of the topics that I cover. But as I do each offseason, I'll have guests on the show throughout this one. And those episodes naturally run a little bit longer for those of you who want a longer show. But truly, I appreciate all the feedback on the show. And I hope that all of this makes sense. And I also apologize if you hate when I talk about this more administrative stuff. So let's stop talking about it and let's get to the mailbag questions for the week. I didn't get a ton, but there were some really, really good ones. This first question is from @RLTom9. Any statistical correlation between college player volume, so snaps, catches, etc., and NFL rookie year fantasy points? If relevant, provide the R-squared value. Love the show. So there are a few things to unpack here. First off, I haven't really looked at college production and strictly rookie season production. My prospecting work is largely based on college production because I found that wide receivers and running backs who are good in the NFL were also productive in college. But I'm looking at their entire NFL careers, not just their rookie season. And I look at different market share categories and see if there are any red flags for players. And really what I've found is that it's rare to find an Alvin Kamara type player or someone who's unbelievably good in the NFL while having a poor college production profile. But I also think we can probably agree that Kamara found the exact right spot for him. You can listen back to old shows that I did before the draft and hear my concerns about Alvin Kamara. And then you can listen after the draft and hear that those concerns became completely irrelevant when he was drafted by the Saints. So that's why college production can't be everything when you're evaluating prospects. And neither can your film analysis. Because once these guys are drafted, their situation matters just as much, especially at the running back position. Going back to the question, if we know producers in the NFL were also producers in college, then it would make sense to at least assume that rookie running backs and wide receivers were also producers in college. Because producers in the NFL usually do something during their rookie seasons. I do want to talk about the R-squared comment that's part of the question here as well. You can make R squared say what you want it to say when you have a ton of different ways to measure two variables, or two data sets. Let me just run through an example. The question we're talking about here says, is there any statistical correlation between college player volume and NFL rookie year fantasy points? So let's just say we're comparing running back rushing attempts or running back rushing share to rookie season fantasy points. One of those variables and one of those data sets is super easy to measure. It's how many fantasy points a running back scores during his rookie season. But the other variable is really not easy to measure at all. Are you looking at a player's college career? Are you looking at his final season? Are you looking at only drafted running backs? Are you looking at every single running back? Are you looking at starting college running backs? Finding your sample will dramatically alter your R squared value. Because let's pretend you want to look at every single Division I running back's final collegiate season and compare that to their rookie season. So you're looking at every Division I running back's final season rushing share and finding the R squared between that and their rookie season output. Well, we know there are loads and loads of players who aren't going to make it to the NFL. And we know that of the running backs who do make it to the NFL, plenty won't sniff a football field during their first year, if at all. So what that means is that your R squared value is likely to be pretty high, or the correlation is going to be pretty strong, because you've got a ton of running backs who didn't carry the ball a lot in college and in the NFL, which means there's a strong correlation. Now, if you shrink your sample to just players who were drafted, then your correlation naturally becomes weaker. You're getting rid of players who weren't good enough to make it to the NFL, and we should assume that a lot of those players weren't carrying the ball a lot in college. That's part of the reason they didn't make it to the NFL. This is why when you see arbitrary parameters set in some sort of study, you should always question the types of conclusions that are being drawn based on correlation. The Superflex study that I did over the last offseason is a pretty good example of this. I wanted to compare preseason average draft position to postseason result among the main fantasy football positions. If I were to compare top 10 quarterbacks to top 80 running backs, you better believe there's going to be a strong R squared among the top 80 running backs. Because the majority of running backs being drafted after like pick 30 are going to produce very few fantasy points. And since they're later round picks, that strengthens your correlation. That's no different than this. And I think it's a really important thing to remember when you're doing any sort of correlation testing or reading articles that are drawing strong conclusions based on the coefficient of determination. This next question is from @SmithBK. If you were playing some FanDuel DFS for the Super Bowl, which you should, what do you think about the likely running back usage for both teams? I think I'm making multiple lineups based on different game narratives. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Think about game script and build lineups based on that game script. Think about a scenario where the Rams go up big. If they're up big, they'll likely have a more run-heavy approach, and that's going to benefit someone like CJ Anderson. And then on the opposite side of the field, James White would be on the field more than Sony Michel. I wrote up a preview of this year's Super Bowl this week on Numberfire, and to be honest, this is actually a pretty tough one to answer. I could see things unfold in a lot of different ways based on the matchup. I do think we end up seeing more Todd Gurley than we did in the NFC Championship, though, because there is a matchup to exploit in the passing game with him. And if the Rams fall behind, I'd expect that to hurt CJ Anderson's value overall. So I very much expect bigger things from Todd Gurley in this game. And I think the Patriots are going to try to deploy their running backs similarly to how we saw in Kansas City. But I don't think they'll be as successful given the things that I said in the article, which was basically that the Rams have been a lot better at stopping the run over the last month or so. James White should be involved, but the Rams were also pretty good at defending shorter passes this year. So I'm not necessarily expecting a double-digit target performance from him unless the Patriots fall behind. So that's kind of where my head's at with these running backs. We'll see how it plays out, but I do think it's a good idea to make lineups based on game script because both teams have enough situation-specific players where you'd be able to do that. This next question's an email. It says, coming into 2018, I and many others were huge fans of Tevin Coleman from a dynasty perspective. The thought was that he would sign with a new team in 2019 and be the lead back. With the Freeman injury, he pretty much got that opportunity in 2018 and wasn't great in that role. How much did he really hurt his long-term value? If he signs somewhere to at least be the lead guy in a timeshare, what do you think his value is in 2019 and moving forward? Steven. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, but Tevin Coleman usually doesn't finish with that high of a success rate according to Numberfire's expected points model. Like, listen to his success rate compared to other backs in the Falcons offense since he entered the league. 2015, Devontae Freeman had a 42% success rate. Tevin Coleman's was at 37%. 2016, Freeman 46%, Coleman 38%. 2017, Freeman 46%, Coleman 32%. And then this past year, Ito Smith was at 43%, and Tevin Coleman was at 38%. This isn't a death sentence because success rate isn't super predictive when looking at an entire sample of running backs. But I wouldn't call this a good sign. Now, I don't think that's the biggest issue with Tevin Coleman this offseason. I think a bigger problem is competition. Not a whole lot of teams absolutely need Tevin Coleman. And there are other backs like Le'Veon Bell, Mark Ingram, TJ Yeldon, Jay Ajayi. There are other running backs who teams might prefer more. I think Coleman is the second best asset at the position behind Bell in this free agent class, but it's not like there's zero competition. I'm not sure if selling Tevin Coleman right now is your best bet, though. Like you said, he's coming off a bad year where the Falcons in general just couldn't run the football that well. And that's going to change how people view Tevin Coleman. But I also don't think fantasy managers are always aware of free agent situations. So if you've got Coleman, you've got to just kind of hold tight and hope that he finds a nice enough landing spot. I think he's talented. I know success rate hasn't loved him, but the eye test at least shows that he's a pretty good back. I just try not to build my dynasty rosters around free agent running backs because of how easy they are to replace for a cheaper cost out of the draft. This next question is from @SomeDinoNoob. Can we point to any observable changes in the league that may have resulted in tight ends losing so much receiving production to wide receivers this year? And what does it hint about the next 2 years' repositional value? So I think I talked about this a bit on episode 208, which was titled Passing Distribution is Changing Fantasy Football. But if you look at the year-over-year trends, the biggest difference with tight ends this season was really just touchdowns. Their share of receiving yards has remained pretty consistent since about 2014. It only dropped by 0.15% this past season. Their target share did drop and see basically a decade low this past year, but it wasn't super significant. It was by less than a percentage point. But within the touchdown share category, tight ends accounted for less than 23% of receiving touchdowns. Last year, that number was almost 27%. And then while that was happening, we saw a bump in wide receiver touchdown share of nearly 5% year over year. So given some of the injuries that we saw to tight ends this year, and given touchdowns bring forth some variance, I actually think that we're going to see a slight rebound for the position in 2019. There's still going to be a select few tight ends like Travis Kelce and George Kittle who are in their own tier. But I do think the position will be better in 2019 than they were in 2018. So that's where I see things trending. This next question says, hey JJ, what's your opinion on Darius Geis? Is he a buy candidate? Some press has risen about there may have been some complications after his ACL surgery, but he looks pretty good running on Instagram. He should have a good offensive line if healthy, and not much competition in the backfield if AP isn't back due to free agency. There's a big question mark at quarterback though. Thanks, Alex. First off, how ridiculously awesome is it that we're such degenerates to the point where we're seeing how a dude looks on Instagram? Like, that's how much we care. It's awesome. But I talked about Geis, I believe, on one of the Mailbag shows closer to the end of the season or maybe in the offseason. And it's a really tough situation to nail down. Now, I liked Geis a lot as a prospect, but his ADP is RB15 right now. So it's not like you're getting some massive injury discount. And I do think there are enough situational things happening to make him not a buy candidate. As you noted, there's the quarterback, who's going to be under center for them, not just in the long term, but even just next season. And then there's Chris Thompson. He's not a free agent until 2020, so he's going to steal some receiving work at least next season. So I don't think he's a buy right now. His cost is pretty fair, and I like Darius Geis. I just don't see him as an obvious value. This next question says, hey JJ, I've had Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen on the same dynasty roster for a while. This year I traded for Kupp a few weeks before his injury, and then Brandon Cooks a few weeks after Kupp got hurt. Heading into next year, I now have all four. We can start up to 5 wide receivers. Would you look to move one of them so my team isn't so dependent on the Vikings and the Rams? Who would you look to move, and what type of return would you look for? Thanks, Dave. I get these types of questions a lot, and I think the simple answer is that if you can project a player's target share and that target share is good and consistent, it doesn't matter. In the Rams and Vikings cases, that should be the case, so it matters a lot less if they're playing on the same team. Now, I haven't done a formal study on this topic, but maybe that's something that I'll try to dive into this offseason. I just wanted to say that if I'm in your shoes, I'm not making a deal just to make a deal. I'm caring about the individual player and how to value him, and I'm also realizing that those are two offenses where sharing receiving production isn't a big deal given how things are distributed. This last question is from @RotoDad. Why should I watch the Super Bowl if I hate both teams? Because football is awesome. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And I'm also on Twitter @LateRoundQB. You can send your mailbag questions there or email me at jj@numberfire.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great weekend.